The dismissal letter reaches your desk at exactly 9:07 on a Thursday morning. You read it once, then again, and one more time. Not because it's confusing, every sentence is crystal clear. You're reading it over because the situation itself feels almost impossible to believe. The letter is signed by Sandra Webb, the Director of Human Resources at Brightline Creative Solutions. It's polite, professional, carefully written. According to the document, you're being terminated due to a repeated pattern of stepping beyond your authority. It claims you've been influencing executive decisions, disrupting the company's reporting structure, and acting far outside the responsibilities of your position as senior content strategist. Everything is written with perfect corporate language. There's only one problem. Sandra Webb has just fired the person who actually owns the company she works for. You quietly place the letter on your keyboard. Your eyes drift toward the second-floor window overlooking downtown Austin. A construction crane slowly rotates in the distance. A pigeon lands on the windowsill, pauses for a brief moment, seems to reconsider its plan, then flies away. You can't help but smile. I understand exactly how you feel, you think. Then you pick up your phone and call the only person who knows the entire story. Because while Sandra documented every incident with remarkable detail, she wasn't wrong. From her perspective, every concern she raised made complete sense. The first incident. About 6 weeks earlier, Danielle was negotiating a contract with one of the company's longtime printing vendors. You weren't scheduled to attend. No one invited you. But the night before, while reviewing internal contract files, you discovered something unusual. The vendor had quietly been billing the company at a rate 14% higher than what the original agreement allowed. So when you heard Danielle mention the meeting in passing, you decided to stop by. You didn't interrupt. You didn't make a speech. Halfway through the discussion, you simply slid a handwritten note across the table. It contained only 4 words. Page 4. Line 17. Danielle opened the contract. She found the clause. Everything changed. The negotiations immediately shifted. By the time the meeting ended, the vendor had accepted revised terms. The company would now save more than $36,000 every year. Sandra's report described the event differently. Employee inserted himself into an executive-level negotiation without authorization. Technically, she wasn't wrong. The second incident. A few weeks later, you noticed something even more concerning. While reviewing internal financial records, you discovered that 2 employees who had worked at Brightline for years had never received their approved cost-of-living raises. Those salary adjustments had been authorized 8 months earlier. Approved personally by you through David. Of course, Sandra had no way of knowing that. Rather than making a public issue of it, you submitted an anonymous report through the company's internal ticket system, the same method you always used. Unfortunately, anonymous wasn't anonymous enough. Sandra traced the request back to your workstation through the system metadata. Her conclusion was straightforward. Unauthorized employee accessed confidential payroll information. Again, based on what she knew, it was a perfectly reasonable conclusion. The third incident. This was the event that convinced Sandra she needed to take formal action. The previous month, a young account coordinator named Bree had been placed on a performance improvement plan by her manager. Sandra personally approved the decision. Yet less than 2 weeks later, everything changed. Bree suddenly received an updated job description. Her salary increased. She was transferred to a completely different client portfolio. From Sandra's perspective, someone behind the scenes had interfered with management's decision and overturned disciplinary action without permission. She believed that someone was you. And once again, she wasn't entirely wrong. Every one of those changes arrived through David, carrying the approval of the company's ownership. Sandra noticed the pattern. She couldn't prove you were the person behind it. But she was experienced, observant, and incredibly good at reading situations. So she connected the dots. From where she stood, it looked as though someone inside the company was quietly influencing major decisions behind the scenes. Someone was bypassing established procedures. Someone was weakening the authority of her department, and every trail seemed to lead back to you. She believed you were running an unofficial operation, building influence in secret for reasons she couldn't understand. The pattern she saw was real. What she misunderstood was its purpose. To understand why everything unfolded this way, you have to go back nearly 38 months, to the day you quietly acquired Brightline Creative Solutions. Most people only heard one number, $4.2 million in annual revenue. On the surface, that sounded like a healthy creative agency. But numbers can be deceiving. The company employed 63 people. When you divided the annual revenue by the size of the workforce, each employee generated only about $66,000 per year. For a marketing agency, that wasn't simply below average. It was a warning sign. A healthy, mid-sized agency typically produces somewhere between $120,000 and $180,000 in revenue per employee. Brightline wasn't even close. It was operating at less than half the expected level. That wasn't the result of bad employees. It was the result of years of poor leadership. The business had grown its payroll without growing its productivity. There were more people than the workload could realistically support. Clients were paying prices that belonged to another era. Profit margins became thinner every quarter, yet nobody seemed willing to confront the reality. The previous owner, Dale Renner, genuinely believed that adding more employees meant building a bigger company. So he kept hiring. First came the new desks. Then he searched for enough projects to keep those desks occupied. It was growth in reverse. Instead of expanding because demand increased, the company created demand to justify expansion. Client pricing followed the same flawed logic. Projects weren't priced according to the value they delivered. They were priced according to what management believed clients would agree to pay. For a while, the strategy looked successful. The office stayed busy. The staff kept growing. Friday pizza lunches continued. People laughed, chatted, split expenses through Venmo, and convinced themselves everything was fine. Meanwhile, the financial foundation beneath them cracked a little more every single quarter. The warning signs weren't hidden. People had already begun leaving. A junior designer named Kesha resigned one Tuesday with almost no explanation. A copywriter named Tom spent his final 2 weeks staring more at his phone than his computer, counting down the days until he could leave. Then there was the social media coordinator. Her resignation email arrived at 11 p.m. It contained only 5 words. "I think I need more." Most people never saw that message. You did. It appeared inside a private folder that almost nobody in the company even knew existed. You saved the email. You never deleted it. Because it wasn't just a resignation. It was evidence. The employees who remained weren't staying because the company inspired them. Many stayed because they felt loyal to their coworkers. Others stayed because the job market wasn't offering better opportunities. Neither reason creates a healthy culture. Both slowly drain an organization from the inside. Then there was David Bob, 51 years old, wire-rimmed glasses. The quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades walking into important meetings, already knowing every answer before the first question was asked. Officially, David served as Brightline's outside legal counsel. To Danielle and the executive team, he represented the mysterious private ownership group behind the company. As far as anyone knew, David was simply the messenger. No one on the executive floor had ever met the owner. Not once. They had only met David. And over time, they learned to trust him. Because every recommendation he delivered, every approval, every strategic decision, turned out to be exactly the right one. What they never realized was that David wasn't making those decisions. He was simply delivering yours. Good decisions have a way of building trust, not all at once, but little by little. Just like money growing through compound interest. Each correct choice made the next one easier to believe. That was exactly how the system worked. Every evening, after everyone else had gone home, you opened a laptop that had never once entered the office. You reviewed reports, contracts, budgets, and employee updates. You made the decisions. You drafted the instructions. Then David transformed those instructions into polished recommendations from the company's ownership group. He signed the documents. He delivered the message. Everyone assumed the decisions were his. In reality, every major move began with you. Raises, contract negotiations, hiring approvals, budget revisions, long-term client retainers. Every important decision passed through David's desk. Every one of them started on yours. One afternoon, while standing in the hallway pretending to organize a folder you didn't actually need, you overheard Danielle speaking with Rob. "Whoever owns this company," she said. "They finally started making the right decisions." You were standing barely 7 feet away. For a second you nearly spilled your coffee. The irony was almost impossible not to laugh at. The very first thing you analyzed after acquiring Brightline wasn't total revenue. It was a much more revealing figure. Revenue per employee. You calculated it during your first week sitting quietly in that ordinary cubicle. The result immediately exposed where the real problem was hiding. The company didn't have a revenue problem. It had an efficiency problem. That realization shaped everything that followed. Strategy 1. Rebuilding the workforce. The corporate phrase was headcount optimization. It sounded clean, organized, professional. The reality was far more complicated. You refused to conduct massive layoffs. Instead, you chose patience. Whenever someone resigned, you carefully evaluated whether their position actually needed to exist before replacing them. Many didn't. Several overlapping roles were redesigned into fewer positions with clearer responsibilities, stronger accountability, and significantly better pay. Over the course of 8 months, natural resignations combined with 2 carefully negotiated departures, both handled through David with generous severance packages. By the end of the process, the workforce had shrunk from 63 employees to 49, yet productivity continued climbing. Revenue generated by each employee steadily increased until Brightline finally began performing like the agency it was always meant to become. Strategy 2. Fixing the pricing model. The next issue was impossible to ignore. Brightline was still charging clients using rates established back in 2019. By 2024, inflation, operating costs, and salaries had all increased dramatically. Every outdated contract quietly reduced the company's profits. Without realizing it, Brightline was subsidizing its own clients. So you took every active agreement home. For 3 straight weekends, you reviewed each one line by line. Then you built an entirely new pricing strategy. Instead of imposing one dramatic increase, you spread the adjustments over 2 quarters. The changes were gradual enough that clients didn't feel blindsided. Yet they were meaningful enough to restore healthy margins. Only 2 clients resisted. One agreed to a smaller scope of work under the new pricing. The other decided to leave. Losing that account didn't bother you. That client generated roughly $60,000 a year while consuming the time and attention of an account that should have been worth more than $200,000. Keeping them would have cost far more than letting them walk away. Danielle described it as a difficult strategic decision made by ownership. You saw it for what it really was. Simple mathematics. Strategy 3. Investing in the right people. The final issue wasn't clients. It was talent. The employees who had remained were loyal, hardworking, capable. But they were also underpaid. Every month they stayed increased the odds that another company would recruit them away. You knew that if Brightline wanted to keep its best people, compensation had to reflect their value. So you prepared a complete salary restructuring proposal. As always, the recommendation went to David. David submitted it on behalf of ownership. Ownership approved it within 48 hours. The result was immediate. Across the company, employees received an average salary increase of 14%. For many, it wasn't just a raise. It was proof that someone they had never met was finally investing in their future. Something changed after the salary adjustments. The constant LinkedIn activity slowed down. The quiet job hunting faded. People stopped looking for the nearest exit. One of the biggest transformations belonged to Bry. She had spent months reporting to a manager who never recognized what she was actually capable of. Her talents were being wasted. Through ownership's direction, her position was redesigned. She received a well-earned raise. She was assigned to the foresight account. 6 months later, she had become the strongest account manager in the entire office. Every day she worked only a few desks away from the person who had changed the course of her career. She had no idea. Strategy 4. Bringing in better business. This was the area where you could have the greatest direct impact, even from an ordinary cubicle. You didn't chase attention. You planted opportunities. During meetings, you asked questions that guided conversations toward possibilities others hadn't considered. Outside the office, you quietly opened doors. One opportunity came through David's professional network. Another came from a connection you had made months earlier at a business conference in Chicago. A conference no one at Brightline even knew you had attended. Those 2 conversations eventually became 2 major clients: a growing retail company based in Dallas, a promising healthcare startup in San Antonio. Together, they added nearly $940,000 in annual recurring revenue. The numbers finally began telling a different story. For 2 straight years, Brightline had remained stuck at $4.2 million in annual revenue. 8 months after the changes began, revenue climbed past $5.1 million. By the end of the fiscal year, projections pointed toward nearly $5.8 million, with only 49 employees instead of 63. This wasn't simply an improved business. It was an entirely different company. Phil started putting the pieces together. You suspected Phil had figured out the truth long before anyone else. The moment that confirmed it happened on a quiet Wednesday night, about 7 months earlier. It was 11:40 p.m. The office was nearly empty. Like so many nights before, you were the last person still working. As you walked through the silent floor, you were on the phone with David, reviewing employee compensation plans. Passing through the lobby, you noticed Phil sitting behind the security desk. A crossword puzzle lay open in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching you, not casually, carefully, with the expression of someone trying to solve a mystery that had been bothering him for months. You ended the call. "Good night," you said. "Good night," Phil replied. Nothing more. 3 weeks later, another late evening, he stopped you before you reached the elevator. He placed his crossword on the desk and looked directly into your eyes. "You're not just another employee here, are you?" It wasn't really a question. He had already reached his conclusion. You held his gaze for a moment. Then you smiled. The same calm, unreadable smile you used whenever Marcus accidentally made your coffee wrong. Friendly, relaxed, completely impossible to interpret. "Phil," you said, "I'm a senior content strategist. That's exactly what my badge says." For several seconds he didn't answer. Then he simply picked up his crossword puzzle again. "Good night." After that, he never mentioned it again, but his behavior changed. He became more selective about who entered the building after hours. He paid closer attention during his nightly security rounds. He double-checked lights that previously wouldn't have caught his attention, almost as if he had decided to protect something important, even if he wasn't entirely sure what that something was. 2 months later, ownership approved a raise for Phil. You told yourself it was simply because he deserved it, which was true. You also told yourself there wasn't any other reason behind the decision. That was mostly true. And that is the story behind Sandra's termination letter. Those were the events she witnessed. Those were the reports she documented. Those were the conclusions she reached. A mid-level content strategist with no official authority somehow kept influencing executive decisions, reshaping departments, improving financial performance, and quietly changing the future of the company. Anyone in her position would have asked the same question. The only thing Sandra misunderstood was who she had just fired. From Sandra's perspective, the evidence kept pointing in the same direction. 3 separate situations. 3 major outcomes. And every trail, if followed carefully enough, seemed to end at your desk. She wasn't acting out of emotion. She was doing exactly what an experienced HR director was supposed to do. So you made a single phone call. To David. Sandra Webb has terminated me, you said. There was silence on the other end. Has she? David finally replied. Signed in blue ink. Another pause followed. The kind of silence that comes from someone whose time is billed by the hour, and whose thoughts are always worth the wait. Finally, he spoke. I'll arrange a company-wide meeting. Friday. 2 o'clock. It's time. Early Friday morning, an invitation appeared in everyone's calendar. Mandatory all-hands meeting. No explanation. No agenda. Only one additional note. Ownership representatives will be present. That single sentence was enough to change the mood of the entire office. People worked, but not very well. Conversations were shorter. Typing sounded louder. Every few minutes someone glanced toward the conference room, hoping to discover a clue. Around 11 o'clock, someone reheated fish in the office microwave. Normally that would have triggered at least a dozen complaints. This time, no one said a word. Everyone was thinking about something else. At exactly 1:45 p.m., David arrived. Gray suit. Wire-rimmed glasses. A worn leather portfolio tucked neatly under one arm. He placed it on the conference table without opening it. One by one, the leadership team took their seats. Danielle sat at the head of the table. Sandra settled 2 chairs away. A printed copy of the termination letter resting neatly in front of her. Marcus, Rob, several department heads. Outside the glass walls, employees quietly gathered, pretending to work while stealing nervous glances toward the meeting. You took your usual seat at the far end of the table, the same chair you had occupied countless times before. David waited, not because he had forgotten what he wanted to say, because he understood the value of silence. He always let the room become just uncomfortable enough before speaking. Most people rush to fill quiet moments. David never did. He knew silence often carried more authority than words. Finally, he looked around the room. I'd like to begin by discussing the termination notice issued yesterday morning. His voice remained calm, measured, completely controlled. Then he slid a document across the table toward Sandra. That termination notice is no longer valid. Allow me to explain. Sandra reached for the papers. The document was a partially redacted copy of the company's acquisition agreement. Most confidential information had been blacked out, but not all of it. Just enough remained visible to establish one unmistakable fact. You watched Sandra begin reading. Her eyes moved through the opening paragraph, then stopped. She blinked, looked back at the top, and read it again. David continued. 38 months ago, Brightline Creative Solutions was purchased by a private individual. His tone never changed. Steady, professional, almost detached. Following the acquisition, that individual chose to assume an operational position within the company while remaining anonymous. For the past 38 months, that owner has worked inside this building, on this very floor. Yesterday's termination notice was issued to that individual. The room fell into complete silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind that settles over people when reality suddenly shifts beneath their feet. For several seconds no one moved. No one spoke. Danielle was the first to react. Slowly, she turned toward you. Not with shock, with recognition. As though dozens of unanswered questions from the past 3 years had suddenly arranged themselves into a single, unmistakable picture. In only a few seconds, her expression transformed completely. First came confusion, then realization, and finally, understanding. Danielle's face changed almost instantly. First came recognition, then the careful process of connecting scattered pieces. Finally, there was something else. Respect. Across the table, Sandra slowly lowered the acquisition agreement. She looked at you, then at David, then back at you again. For a brief moment, disbelief crossed her face, but it didn't stay there. She was too experienced for that. Instead, her expression settled into something far more professional. The quiet acceptance of someone who realized they had been outplayed, not by deception, but by a strategy they never knew existed. Danielle broke the silence first. "The vendor negotiation," she said softly, almost thinking out loud. One of the senior account directors continued the list. The performance plan, the pricing overhaul, the new client acquisitions. Rob leaned back in his chair. "Foresight," he murmured to himself. His expression resembled someone finally discovering how a magician had performed an impossible trick. Across the table, Marcus remained silent. His eyes stayed fixed on the polished wood in front of him. You knew exactly what was happening. He was replaying every conversation the two of you had ever shared, every campaign review, every suggestion, every afternoon when you casually asked a question that somehow led the team toward a better decision. Piece by piece, the puzzle was assembling itself. There was no need to interrupt him. Soon enough, he would understand. You allowed the silence to linger, not awkwardly, intentionally. Only after everyone had enough time to absorb the truth did you finally speak. It was a sentence you had quietly rehearsed in your mind for months. "Before I could improve this company, I needed to understand what it truly was, and there was only one way to do that. Not from the executive office, but from the desks where the real work happened every day." The room became quiet once again. This time it wasn't confusion, it was reflection. No one was searching for answers anymore. They were reconsidering everything they thought they knew. Sandra finally closed her folder. She aligned the papers carefully, placed her pen neatly across the top. Every movement was calm and deliberate. Then she looked directly at you. "I'd like to meet on Monday," she said. "We need to redesign our HR reporting structure now that ownership is no longer a mystery." You smiled. You had always respected Sandra. She had investigated the facts, followed the evidence, made the best decision she could with the information available to her. "Monday works for me," you replied. Later that evening, you left the office exactly as you had so many nights before. Last one out. The building was silent. Most of the lights had already switched into their overnight setting. Outside, the glow of Austin's skyline reflected through the tall south-facing windows. Before heading to the elevator, you took one slow walk through the office. Whiteboard still covered with ideas. Sticky notes scattered across desks. Headphones hanging from workstation dividers. Near Bree's desk sat a framed photograph. She was laughing beside someone who looked like her younger sister, both completely unaware of the camera. The office felt different now. Not because of the furniture. Not because of the walls. Because of the people inside it. There were 49 employees now instead of 63. Every role had a purpose. Every salary reflected real value. The business was no longer quietly losing money behind polished presentations and optimistic meetings. For the first time in years, the company was moving forward instead of simply surviving. When the elevator doors opened in the lobby, Phil was waiting behind the security desk. Tonight, his crossword puzzle lay open instead of face down. The moment he noticed you, he set his pencil aside. You stopped beside his desk. "You knew," you said. It wasn't an accusation, just a simple observation. Phil considered the question the way he considered everything else, without rushing, without trying to impress anyone. After a long pause, he smiled faintly. "Not at first," he admitted, "but after a while, I realized ordinary employees don't quietly change the direction of an entire company." He glanced toward the now empty office before looking back at you. "I didn't need to know your title. I only needed to see the results." For a moment, neither of you spoke. Then Phil picked up his crossword again. "Good night, he said with the same calm voice as always. You smiled. Good night, Phil. As the elevator doors closed, the office disappeared from view. Not as the struggling company you had quietly purchased 38 months earlier, but as the thriving business it had finally become. Rebuilt from the inside. One careful decision at a time. Phil looked around the quiet lobby before answering. I've worked in this building a long time, he said. I know who arrives early, and I know who always leaves after everyone else. He smiled faintly. You hear a lot when the hallways are empty. A brief silence followed. Then he added with perfect timing. Your attorney is brilliant, but he has a habit of talking a little too loudly during late-night phone calls. You couldn't help it. A genuine laugh escaped. Not a polite chuckle, a real one. The kind that catches you by surprise. Then why didn't you ever say anything? You asked. Phil glanced down at his crossword puzzle, turning his pencil slowly between his fingers. Because it wasn't my story to tell, he shrugged. Besides, he leaned back comfortably in his chair. What you were doing was helping this place. The company needed it. The people needed it even more. He looked up one last time. Didn't seem like there was any reason for me to get in the way. For a moment, you simply stood there, out of everything that had happened that day. That sentence stayed with you the most. The people needed it. Somehow, those 4 words carried more weight than the acquisition documents, more than the meeting, even more than Sandra's stunned expression. Only hours earlier you had received a termination letter. By mid-afternoon, your identity as the company's owner had been revealed. Before the workday ended, the same HR director who had tried to dismiss you was already arranging a meeting to redesign the organization's leadership structure. It had been one extraordinary day. Yet Phil's quiet observation was the part you knew you would remember. You smiled. Good night, Phil. Without looking up from his crossword, he answered. Good night. He waited just long enough before adding one final word. Boss. Outside, the Austin evening felt warm. The scent of cedar drifted through the air. Somewhere nearby, the unmistakable smell of approaching rain lingered on the breeze. You climbed into your aging Honda Civic, but instead of starting the engine, you sat quietly for a minute, with your hands resting on the steering wheel. Your thoughts wandered through the day. Danielle's expression as the truth finally made sense. Sandra carefully closing her folder after accepting what she had just learned. Then, Bry, you remembered the performance report she had submitted only a few days earlier. It had arrived in your private inbox before anyone else saw it. You forwarded it to David with a single sentence. She's ready for the next opportunity. You smiled at the memory.
Cold. 38 months earlier, Brightline had been a struggling agency hiding serious problems beneath respectable-looking numbers. 8 months earlier, it had only begun to change. Now it was something entirely different. Revenue reflected the true value of the work being delivered. Staffing matched the actual workload instead of empty ambition. Employees stayed because they wanted to, not because they felt trapped. That was what a real turnaround looked like. Not a flashy press release, not a headline announcing record growth, not an executive standing on a stage celebrating success. A true turnaround was quieter than that. It was a building full of talented people who finally had the tools, opportunities, and compensation they deserved. It was trust rebuilt one decision at a time. It was a healthier business created through patience instead of spectacle. And at the center of it all, cold, a bus of gas, a man sitting in an ordinary cubicle on the second floor. Someone everyone believed was simply an exceptionally capable employee. In truth, he really was. The only thing they never realized was that he had been leading the company all along. You turned the key, the engine came to life, and with one last glance at the office in your rearview mirror, you drove into the Austin night.